I was going to do one of those Canon R5C roundup videos or reaction videos, but I feel like I'm a few days too late, and really the shelf life for that kind of video is only a week, 2 weeks maybe. But I did want to sort of tie in the R5C into this video, which is just a fun video, just a speculation video. It's a wish list video about the potential Sony a7S4/FX4. So don't expect to learn anything from this video. There's really no value to it. Just me talking about cameras, which I find fun. Now, I don't expect the follow-up to the a7S3 or the FX3 to come down the pipeline anytime soon. It took Sony a full 5 years to update the Sony a7S2, and it's only been about not even 2 full years since the a7S3 came out. So I'd say we still have a few years to go. With that said, I just wanted to talk about what I would personally like to see in the next video-centric or sensitive camera that Sony makes, especially in light of what Canon just released in the R5C. I would also like to make clear that I find that the a7S3/FX3 is a fantastic camera, and I am in no hurry to upgrade or switch cameras anytime soon. It's not perfect, and of course no camera is nor can be, but this is a wish list video, so we're going to hope for perfection. So the Canon R5C just got announced and is supposed to be releasing in a couple months' time, I guess, from the recording of this video. And it's got some really impressive stuff. It also has some Canon cripple hammer features, but I'm not really hating on it. I think it's amazing for what it is, and I think it's just the fact that it exists and gives you 8K full frame raw internal recording up to 60 frames per second is mighty impressive. It's also about $4,500, which is $1,000 more than the a7S3 and around, $700-800 more than FX3. And that's one thing that I don't want to see increase with the next round of S cameras from Sony. The price already crept up quite a bit from the a7S2, and I personally don't want to spend $4,000, $4,500, or heaven forbid, $5,000 on a little mirrorless camera like this. So I definitely don't want it to go that route. If that's what it takes to get internal RAW, then you can keep it. So let's talk about the things that I would like to see come into the Sony a7S4 and the FX4. More professional video-centric features like monitoring tools and shutter angle would of course be welcomed on the a7S4 and the FX4. You get these on the Canon R5C, but they're also in all the Panasonic's cameras, and they've been there since the GH cameras, at least the GH5, and they're in the S1 and the S5 cameras as well. There's really no reason that they shouldn't be in at least the FX4, right? Because it's the cinema camera. The next thing I would like to see is DCI 4K. Now this isn't a huge deal. There's not a huge difference in resolution between UHD 4K and DCI 4K. The sensor, the current sensor, the 12 megapixel sensor in the a7S3 and FX3 has more than enough resolution to output DCI 4K. They do it on the FX6, so there's really no reason except for segmentation that it's not on the a7S3 and FX3. The reason it matters somewhat is if you watch YouTube, you see more and more people doing wider formats than 16:9. And if you want to do a wider format than 16:9 on these cameras, that does mean that you're cropping some and you're losing some resolution. So if you were able to shoot 17:9 natively, you could get that slightly wider aspect ratio without cropping. I also think, given that Sony marketed the FX3 as a cinema camera, should have DCI 4K. It would be nice to have some more flexibility in the high frame rates mode. So I like the fact that you can shoot like 1, 2, and maybe 5 and 10 frames per second for doing time-lapse recordings, but it would also be nice if you could get some higher frame rates besides just 60 and 120, such as you get in the Panasonic cameras. So you can do 48, 96, 180, and pretty much everything in between there. Another feature that the R5C introduced is a timecode input, and I would love to see something like that come to the a7S4/FX4. If you're not familiar with the Tentacle Sync products, they allow you to sync up multiple cameras and multiple audio sources with just about any type of camera. So you don't need a Genlock port, nor do you need a BNC port like you have on the Canon R5C. You can sync timecode with the 3.5mm jack on something like the a7S3. However, when you do input a Tentacle Sync into the 3.5mm jack, you lose audio recording. Now that's not such a big deal because now you're syncing all the cameras and hopefully you're getting audio from some source, and then you're using timecode to sync everything. But if something were to go wrong and maybe you just want scratch audio from this camera, you can't get it. So it would be nice if they were to introduce some other method of timecode with the next cameras. I already did mention internal RAW, and that would be awesome. That would be super welcome. Definitely wouldn't turn it down. I would like to see more flexibility when it comes to external RAW capabilities. Right now you can shoot RAW over HDMI in these cameras. However, you can only do it with ProRes RAW. And the problem with that, for someone like me who edits in DaVinci Resolve, ProRes RAW is not currently compatible with DaVinci Resolve. So I would like for the codecs to become more widely adopted by everybody, so that regardless of what NLE you're using, you can use ProRes RAW. Or it would be nice if Sony would collaborate with Blackmagic and give you Blackmagic RAW over the HDMI connection as well, so that way everybody can take advantage of that function. Speaking of cinema cameras, how about anamorphic monitoring and even open gates? A year ago, I would not have even wished for this or complained about this or even thought that it was something that anybody needed. However, with Sirui, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they just released their first full-frame anamorphic lens. I think it's a 50mm 1.6 times anamorphic, and they have plans to release more focal lengths in the near future. Sirui started out making anamorphic lenses for Micro Four Thirds and crop sensor cameras, and now they're expanding into full frame. If you want to use an anamorphic lens on the a7S3 FX3, you're going to be shooting that full 16:9 aspect ratio, which means paired with a 1.6 times anamorphic lens, you're going to get something that's really, really wide. However, if you were able to shoot an open gate on the 3:2 aspect ratio of the sensor, you would get a perfect 2:3:9:1 aspect ratio, which is your traditional cinematic aspect ratio widescreen. What if there were true segmentation with the a7S4 and the FX4 for one particular feature? What if you ditched the IBIS for the FX4 but got an internal variable ND? Would that be a worthy compromise? And if you really wanted the IBIS, then you could get the a7S4. Now, I personally would like to have the variable ND in both cameras. And if you could have IBIS too, great. As I mentioned at the beginning, I wouldn't expect to see an S4, FX4 for another couple years. And in that time, of course, Sony's going to be doing R&D and development on new sensors, but I would imagine they're also going to be developing new processors. And who knows what technology might be possible in the next couple of years. What would be cool is seeing some of that image processing technology that you're getting in smartphones that allow for high dynamic range, basically capturing multiple exposures in one shot. So it's protecting the highlights and also giving you good shadow information. And this is like a very process intensive and obviously heat generating kind of process, which is only workable in something like a smartphone because the sensor is so small. But when you're looking at a big full frame sensor, the processing power, computational workload is going to be so much bigger. I'm not hopeful that that kind of technology is going to be right around the corner.
If those computationally based or software-based improvements to dynamic range aren't a thing or possible, what about the option of a dual gain output sensor? Now, this is different from a dual gain sensor, which is talking about ISO values. Dual gain output, which you do see on a couple of cameras. There's a C300 Mark III and a C70. And I also think it's in some of the Alexas and maybe the Red cameras too. So this basically has like a circuit that's prioritizing capturing highlight information and one that's prioritizing capturing information in the shadows. And those get combined to give you potentially more dynamic range than the sensor could normally capture. Now, Sony is kind of a leader and innovator and one of the biggest sensor manufacturers. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that they could go this route, or maybe they could even come up with something new and potentially better in the future.
What about resolution? So honestly, I am perfectly happy with the 4K resolution that we're getting out of these cameras. And I just recently watched a video from a channel called In-Depth Cine, which I will link in the description, where he talks about this push for higher and higher resolutions and how it doesn't always fit the project and isn't always desirable necessarily. But we're starting to see that more and more with, Netflix and other companies really pushing that high resolution, and obviously Canon prioritizing video shooting in 8K, Red's doing the same, Blackmagic with the 12K. And I'm not saying there's not use cases for those, but I would say in especially this level for people just doing content for YouTube or maybe smaller video production companies, Again, there can be really valid use cases for having an 8K capture that allows you to punch in and reframe. You know, with an 8K capture, you can punch in 4 times and still output 4K at full quality. So that's pretty awesome. Or is it 8 times? Yeah, it must be 4 times. I'm not good at math, but it's a lot. So that's all well and good. On the other hand, so many people are still complaining about how sharp these cameras are. Even the a7S3 and the FX4, which were only really outputting 10 megapixels for 4K video, they're still too sharp. They're still too digital. So people are using vintage lenses. They're using softening filters. They're doing stuff in post-production in order to take that digital edge or that sharpening, that digital look out of their footage. So say all that just to reiterate that I'm more than happy with 4K 12 megapixel sensor. I like these cameras being lower resolution and super high performance. If there is going to be a bump in resolution, I would be okay with 6K as long as we still keep that really fast sensor readout, which results in very limited or very minimal rolling shutter. I totally forgot to talk about autofocus, but the autofocus is so good, there's really not that much that I think needs to be improved, although I'm sure they're going to improve it. And of course, there's a couple things that were introduced in the a7 IV and I believe the A1 as well that I think can come to the current cameras with a firmware update. But one thing that I would really like to see, and I think this exists in the FX6 and the FX9, I'm not 100% sure, but I know that it's in Canon's EOS cinema line cameras, and I believe then it would be in the R5C. And that is, so it's got eye tracking, face tracking going on here. So if I were to get up and walk out of the frame, the camera, the lens would then focus on something in the background. But what I'd like to see is if it would just maintain its current plane of focus if me or whatever subject actually left the frame. Does that make sense? I know it's a very niche kind of use case, but the autofocus has gotten so good, but it's a dead giveaway that you're using autofocus when the lens racks to the background when the subject leaves the frame. I think that's everything, and I think my list is pretty reasonable. There's really not that much to complain about with where we are in terms of the cameras that are available to us small-time creators. It's pretty insane. I don't know that there's that big a leap left for the a7S4, and it really is a lot of smaller quality of life improvements, a lot of like video-centric features that really should be in these cameras that already exist in a lot of competing cameras. But I also don't know where the technology is going to go, and I don't know what's possible for these cameras at this price range and in this form factor. A lot of the really cool things that I would hope for, like maybe a dual gain sensor, and I meant dual gain output. It's confusing. Some of that image processing, I'm not sure that it's going to be doable at this level that soon. But we'll see. Let me know what you guys think about the potential of an a7S4 or FX4. And also, what do you think about the Canon R5C? I know it's controversial like most Canon cameras are these days, but I am not going to hate on it because I think the big issue that people are having with Canon of late is really their marketing. Their marketing is sort of over-promising. And if they would just kind of rein in their marketing and just say, hey, here's this new camera and here's what it can do, I think people would be really impressed with it. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. And as always, I appreciate you watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you in another one.